I have a couple of questions to your presentation. You stress the importance of trust in the digital trade agreement, and you also mentioned the importance of directly putting the trust element into the agreement, and also you touched upon the importance of involving the citizens and netizens into the trust building or building up the framework for the trade agreement. So, and you also mentioned the importance of the interoperability of the regulatory authority among the different governments. So, what will be the first step to change the mode and change the behavior of the government or negotiator to make agreement more relevant to today's reality of the economic development and technological development?
Well, you know, one way to do it is crowdsourcing. Almost every democracy does have a process for asking the public, what do you think about us negotiating this trade agreement? Like I just cite as example, New Zealand in that regard, right? So they have a public announcement and then they ask the public for comments and then they collect it online. But what if you actually asked the public for help? What if you said, we want to hear your opinion on, do we need rules regarding the mixing of data? Do we need rules regarding whether or not we should work with other governments to regulate the big platforms? Those kind of questions. And, you know, one thing that in the Obama administration they did, had an ombudsman who would hear concerns about where trade policy was going. And so there's all sorts of innovations that governments could put in place to build trust with their own citizens. But what I'm actually talking about is building trust internationally into the language of the agreement. And that, I think, requires a totally different take on how you make trade policy and how you talk about what it is about. To me, like, you know, the way that people talk about it is often that trade agreements regulate protectionism. But to me, trade agreements give you a voice in other countries. You work with other countries to set rules governing cross-border data flows or cross-border flows of professional services or whatever. And, you know, I know that that's asking too much because right now there's so much pressure because of COVID-19 to innovate digitally because everybody works and studies and dates and socializes online instead of with each other. But I do think we need to rethink this because we are failing. All of us are failing to create a secure online experience. Like I said, there's way too much disinformation. There's way too much, you know, cyber insecurity. And yet we are not doing anything about it. Now you might say back to me, should we in trade agreements? And I think if trust is the end objective, if you want to build trust, you have no choice.
Thank you very much. Trust by people and trust by citizens for the data governance. That's a very important message from you. And my last question is: there are different model of data governance regarding data flow and trust for data. Some governments are basically allowing free flow of data, but other governments are sort of would like to control or even monitor the data flow. And so what's your view on these kind of different governance for the data economy?
So this is what I'm working with we're training the UK government on exactly that question. What is digital protectionism and why is there no shared definition of it? And, it is normative. What is the legitimate role of government to protect its citizens from harm? So like, I have to laugh. There's only 2 cases at the WTO that ever discussed this. And there was the case on internet gambling, right? Where the US said, the reason we want to limit only US companies can provide internet gambling because foreign companies might have lots of corruption, et cetera. So we have a public morals rationale. And I would say the exceptions are so broad. We see this with national security. We need to really think about what is legitimate government responsibilities online and what is essentially impeding market access. So can I give you an example of one that I think is quite controversial? So in the United States right now, the United States is, the US International Trade Commission is exploring whether censorship is a trade barrier. So censorship impedes market access, right? Japanese companies, you have a choice to make. If they want to offer digital services in China, they have to accede to extensive national security rules, right? That China justifies under Article 21, the exceptions. But isn't that a barrier to market access? Even though they're saying they have to do it for national security reasons. If that is so, are there ways that it can be limited? But if you say censorship is a trade barrier, what about DDoS attacks, which also impede market access? Can I give you one more example? What about disinformation related to a company, which we've seen this happen with a Swiss company, where disinformation led to a stock market crash for a particular company. And, basically disinformation doesn't always come across borders, but in that particular example, people in one country were setting out disinformation about a company in another country. So we have all these new issues and we've got to figure out ways to make these rules technologically neutral, but clearer. And I know that won't be easy, but we can't not start now. The other thing we have got to do is find ways to recognize that the way Japan regulates and the way the US regulates and the way the EU regulates, it's going to be different. We have different norms and different priorities, but we have got to find ways to make this interoperable. That's why I'm a big fan of language on regulatory coherence. What about you?
Yeah, that's very important point, and we need to make a different system interoperable. So, yeah, there are many issues we need to discuss, and thank you very much for your perspective and your presentation. That was very insightful.